and graciously to accept it to sponsor this event in honor of Olga's new book. So we're here to celebrate this newest book of Olga's, who writes so much that we cannot catch up with her. So her newest book, called Greek Tragedy and Modernist Performance, Hellenism as Theatricality. I will tell you some things about Olga herself and about our respondents. They will speak and then we'll open up to a discussion. You can raise your hands to talk, or you can also write on the chat and I will convey your questions to our speakers. So Professor Taxidou is Professor Emerita of Drama and Performance Studies at the University of Edinburgh, and since 2015 also visiting professor at NYU every spring. She specializes in performance theory with a particular emphasis on issues of modernism and gender, and she has also worked on cinema and theater and the adaptations of classical texts. She is the author of several books, including Tragedy, Modernity and Mourning, and Modernism and Performance, Jarry to Brecht. She also co-edited with Vasiliki Kolokotroni, Modernism, an anthology of sources and documents, and its complementary volume, a dictionary of modernism. She has also co-edited with John Orr, Post-War Cinema and Modernity, a film reader. Olga, as most of you know, is also well known, is also very well known for adaptations of Greek tragedies herself, which have been performed in many places, including Edinburgh, Moscow, Warsaw, Sarajevo, and here in New York with Maboon Line some years ago, with a great success, which was a great success. I personally consider Olga to be one of the most intelligent and sensitive readers of drama, and the fact that she can move so easily between theory, discussions of theory, and also ancient and modern drama also makes her a very acute reader of it, and she draws all kinds of connections that not everybody can always. I've also, have known her for very many years now, over 25 years. She's been working with us in the summer program in Athens, teaching there, and of course the past years at NYU. And as you understand, I've also sat with her in lectures, in talks, we co-teach courses. So it is my great pleasure to organize this event, and so I can show her my appreciation, my admiration, and my love. And thank you all for being here to help me do that. I'll go now to our two respondents. First of all, thank you both for agreeing to talk. The first respondent will be Professor Fiona McIntosh, who is Professor of Classical Reception and Fellow at St. Hilda's College and Director of the Archive of Performance of Greek and Roman Drama at the University of Oxford. Fiona's work at the archive, her own research, also her numerous publications, everybody knows Fiona McIntosh, have in so many ways contributed or maybe even created the framework for what we call reception studies. Her most recent book, co-authored with Justin McConnell, Performing Epic or Telling Tales, radically revises our understanding of epic and in terms of history, politics, and aesthetics, and will surely generate much more research in this field. Professor Susan Jones is Professor Emerita of English Literature at the University of Oxford too, and a leading scholar on dance and modernism. Her book, Literature, Modernism and Dance, helped to sketch out a whole new framework of dance and modernism, and a new field of research in some respects. And as a dancer herself, she has helped to found DanceOx, which is a foundation that promotes scholarships for dancers and brings together academics and choreographers and dancers. I think we will, again, as I said before, we will begin by Professor McIntosh, we'll go on to Professor Jones, then to Professor Taxidou, and then we'll entertain questions, which you can do in person or you can write on the chat. So thank you all for being here, and I'll pass the torch to you, Professor McIntosh.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor and a great privilege to be invited to respond to this extraordinary book. And I think many of us have been waiting for this for a long time. And as with all great books, the fact that we've waited a little while is all to the benefit of the book. And on every page, I admire the depth of scholarship. As Olga well knows, she spoke to my students, my graduate students, my postdocs, and my undergraduates this term, all on one kind of Zoom call, and enthralled them absolutely. So it's not just people of my vintage who are going to take things away, but generations out there hungry for this book. So one of the reasons why I'm so impressed by it is that I know many people have tried to write a book on classics and modernism. They've been given, British Academy, this, that, and the other, but honestly, most the project. They've abandoned it for, in a way, most of the obvious reasons. Classical thought, classical precedences are everywhere in modernism. And just one kind of example that came to mind, Gilbert Norwood, writing in his book on Euripides and Shaw, 1911, says, as an Edwardian gentleman, he says, we can understand Pericles better than we understand Palmerston. The Greeks at this time are being invoked as guides, even as kin, weirdly, but all the time with every new intellectual endeavor. As Olga reminds us, the Greeks are lurking in the wings, sometimes center stage. They're behind, let's think about it, those new academic disciplines. They're behind archaeology, which is now becoming an official academic discipline. They're behind comparative anthropology, that other new discipline. They're also, very importantly, and obviously much better known perhaps, behind emergent psychoanalytical theory and practice. But I think what is also new at this time is that there's an excitement about these new disciplines that's extending beyond the academy. Even older disciplines, such as philosophy, are being revived, remade with new readings of the Greeks. And of course, and as Olga reminds us, it is Nietzsche above all who is the chief mediator here, who Nietzsche, that classicist who was shunned during his lifetime following the publication, first of all, of Birth of Tragedy by the Classical Academy, but whose ideas percolated throughout the literary, visual, and performance cultures of modernism. Now, what Olga does here, and I think one reason why it's only Olga who could succeed in writing this book about classics and modernism, is because she's the first to offer a successful exploration of the power exerted by ancient Greece on this extraordinary 70, 80-year period. What she does brilliantly is join up the multiple strands, multiple peoples, and that's what I think really is striking. Peoples who are usually considered in isolation. Who but Olga could have written a book that included HD alongside Bertolt Brecht? I know no other person but Olga. So she joins up the multiple strands within the multiple peoples within the series of networks that constitute cultural modernism. And unlike many people who tend to work either in the Anglosphere or even, perhaps in German studies alone, what Olga does, and again, because Olga can do it, she ranges across, tracing those networks across time and place with such enormous skill, and thereby affords really interesting new insights. And of course, what she's done is she keeps a tight focus, a very tight focus on tragedy as a mode of performance. What Olga argues for is us thinking about tragedy as a laboratory for experimentation, and a laboratory, as she shows, that has profound resonance to this day. Tragedy then is not a literary text, it's a performance text in Olga's reading, and it enables a performer, an actor or a dancer, and of course a director, to mediate, as she demonstrates, between different disciplines. So between comparative anthropology and indeed archaeology, mediate between different disciplines, different genre, and different art forms. All theatre makers, as she reminds us, not just the writer, can now engage with tragedy and contribute to the development and the growing development of new bodies of theory, new discourses around tragedy at this time. And as she explains, the discourses do still remain current in actor training, in discussions about translation in practice and translation in theory, and especially around debates about translating for the stage. So Greek tragedy and modernist performance, as she says, is not offering performance histories, the kind of thing that the APGRD did and continued to do. No, really interestingly, is despite the fact that all of her subjects in this book, think Duncan, Craig, Eliot, Yeats, H.D., Artaud, Brecht, all of them in some ways rewrite, maybe with the body, maybe with a pen in hand. They translate, they stage Greek tragedies. But that's not Olga's interest. What she's interested in is looking at the process. It's not the product that is important here. And that seems to me to be absolutely key. Many of these productions, if we only think of the end result, are well-known failures, especially, and some of them, of course, never actually saw a professional production. Failures they may be, as Olga reminds us, but they are hugely creative and constructive ones. So it's the process in the modernist experiment that matters. And it's the process that Olga traces hugely informatively for us. So, as I've already said, it's a really informed and wide-ranging monograph. And what I really like is that it doesn't stop around about 1950. Olga reminds us that the supposed differences between modernist tragedy and postmodern performance, in Hans Thies Lehmann's terms, between tragedy, or as he calls it, drama, and post-dramatic theatre, the differences, as she points out, are not one of kind, as Lehmann definitely in post-dramatic theatre implies, and I know subsequently he's modified that claim. So the difference between modernist performance and postmodern theatre is really one of degree. For these modernist experiments, as Olga cogently and lucidly argues, these modernist experiments unearth a post-dramatic quality in the tragedy. So it's not something that's discovered simply at the end of the century. We need to go back, as at certain moments some post-dramatic theorists seem to invite us to do. But more importantly, and I think this is really interesting, if post-dramatic theatre, as delineated by Lehmann, has often been criticised for its apolitical stance, for its detachment from actuality, these modernist theatrical experiments need revisiting, as Olga really emphasises. And of course, those experiments can be written, they can be études, they can be bodily texts, they can be gestures or gestures. And they need revisiting above all, or precisely, because the experiments were explicitly designed to inspire radical thought and action beyond the theatre. And as Olga demonstrates, they continue to do so well into the 20th century. So I can't thank you enough, Olga, not only for having written a book that brings together some of my top 10 kind of theatre makers, but also for having written a book that shows that modernism has resonance to this day, and that it has the kind of resonance and potential that perhaps we need now more than ever. So thank you.
Professor Jones, thank you very much, Professor McIntosh. Professor Jones, is your turn now. Thank you.
Fiona, thank you so much for that. Olga, thank you so much for asking me to respond to your book. And I'm absolutely indebted to you, Olga, for illuminating for us your complex, sophisticated theory of modernist performance. Olga explores Hellenism as a way of doing things. I think I'm going to be reiterating a few of the things that Fiona said, but I'm going to go off at a tangent in a minute. She explores a theatre of embodiment now as much as a specific reference to a period of drama then. And this resonates with so many modernist preoccupations and productions in different media. Hellenism, in Olga's picture, acts as a license for radical experimentation in ways that I think all modernist students ought to know about. I'm fascinated by the way in which, given the individuality of modernist writers, say Ezra Pound or Eliot or H.D.'s highly subjective versions of Greek drama, Olga's thesis of Hellenism as theatricality unifies, in many ways, a set of theoretical expressions of performance media for modernism. Not only does this book open up the idea of the tragic as poetics, the tragic as performance event, bringing to the table new sets of relations between director and actor and so on, it also encompasses far more than Greek tragedy as a reference point, although, as Fiona says, we go back to it. She interweaves other frameworks, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu narratives, the Japanese No, reminding us that her conception of modernist performativity indeed recognizes forms that do not necessarily involve ideological gestures associated with borrowing authority from the classical, and that performance practice is front and center of the experiment of looking at this account of Hellenism. I'm also delighted, as a dance scholar, that the book opens out the languages of performance to include a new way of looking at dance and movement, both human and technological, as inclusive of rather than separate from categories of theatricality more traditionally associated with text-based drama. And Olga does so boldly by beginning her study with the dancer Isadora Duncan in relation to the dramaturg Edward Gordon Craig. Of course, dance in its broadest sense is now widely recognized for its importance throughout the history of classical reception, largely thanks to Fiona McIntosh and others. And I think what Olga does with her theorization of Hellenism as theatricality is now to provide a particular turn that might actually enable dance studies, or perhaps more appropriately choreographic studies, given the etymological sources of the word, to think of itself as constituent not only of a tragic poetics, but also as essentially the innovation of a modernist poetics of theatricality. This theory of Hellenism suggests itself to me in many modernist forms that lie beyond the pages of the book, but that remind me that much of modernism is about the materiality of the body and movement in a way that is indeed indebted to ideas generated by Greek drama. I'm reminded on the one hand of the theme of masks that appears throughout the book by looking at Vanessa Bell's portrait of her sister Virginia Woolf in 1912, lounging in a deck chair. Bell almost gives Woolf a classical mask in this portrait. No physiognomic details here, just a blank face. But to bring me back to the theme of dance, the accent is all on the movement of Woolf's figure that was so characteristically her way of sitting. Profoundly performative, I think, yet not bound up with individual identity in conventional modes of representation. And I find it interesting that it was the movement of the chorus that enabled Woolf to talk about experiencing Greek drama while not knowing Greek. And in this painting, Bell shows her distinctive figure somehow expressing her physical movement as that which might identify her. On the other hand, we get more problematic evocations of the chorus and chorality in representations of dance in modernism. And we might discuss about the ways in which these continue to echo the Greek drama. Many appear in D.H. Lawrence's late Mexican fiction, for example, in The Woman Who Rode Away, where the pull of the chorus leads a woman apparently willingly to her death. Remember the Rite of Spring, or in The Plumed Serpent, ensures a new authoritarian political order. But of course, these gestures to the chorus here are gestures to the Maya, Pueblo Indian dance forms. But the inclusivity of Olga's thesis, I think, would recognize this, and we do well to follow this through. And in turn, the dance resonates with Lawrence's earlier influences from his travels in Europe, which is indeed related to his sense of what constitutes the Greek. Although I suspect his late political ideology in The Plumed Serpent comes more from Wolfgang Greis's proto-fascist philosophy than from the idea of Greek dance he observed with Frida at the arts community in Ascona in Switzerland. But on the question of modernist dramaturgy, which is really, part of the big title of the book and its relation, and I'm trying to forge something more of its relation to dance, I think one might, after arriving at Olga's magisterial chapter on Brecht, go back and follow the conceptual moves through Aristotle and Plato, through Kleist, Hölderlin, Nietzsche, and the theories of the post-dramatic, to arrive at someone like Samuel Beckett as essentially both choreographic and Hellenistic in these terms. Indeed, Hölderlin's definition of the caesura, and thank you, Olga, for this, as Olga places in relation to Brecht's gestus, seems to me to capture something of the choreographic essence of Beckett's drama, where the, quote, rhythmic sequence of representations depends on an emptiness, a counter-rhythmic rupture, a gap that is the place of theatricality, certainly according to Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, whom Olga quotes. And Olga's thesis leads to the theoreticization of that very friction, tension, contradiction we find almost as a summing up of the tragic predicament at the end of Godot. Well, shall we go? Yes, let's go. they do not move. So the spatialization of time by the body is paramount here and reminds us of a kind of Benjaminian Yetzite that Olga also explores. Her discussion of modernist temporalities may remind one of Ricoeur's reading of Aristotle through Augustine, the distentio animi, that focuses on imagination and tense as the ground of narrative movement forward and back in the present moment of telling, while they do not move, as in Beckett. So facilitated by Olga's interpretation of Hellenism, then, I'd say that movement and indeed stillness in many ways lies at the heart of one aspect of her theory. Hellenism is constituted by the very materiality of the body, both individual and choral, as well as in the body's absence, the subsumption of the individual into the chorus, the body in action, in repose. So to finish up this placing of movement at the heart of this, of Hellenism, this creativity in bodily activity that Fiona mentioned before, in space and through time, I'll just give a word on the chapter on Isadora, who is, after all, the famous innovator of modern dance, who drew on the inspiration of Greek statuary and was inspired by the writings of Nietzsche. Of course, it has to be said that today we need to take on board the less savory politics of Isadora's thinking. You know, her essay on I See America Dancing sees only white America dancing, I think. Nevertheless, for the purposes of the theorization of Hellenism, Isadora's work illustrates an essential shift to modernism. Olga brilliantly observes the striking importance for her theory of Isadora's pairing with her lover, Edward Gordon Craig, and the inspiration they drew from one another. Olga Riley shows how Duncan and Craig's compatibility appears superficially paradoxical, with Isadora's focus on expressionism and Craig's search for the actor as Übermarionette. But in fact, it was not. Olga observes that their creative relationship worked in tandem to forge an innovative theatricality. It also takes us to the very heart of modernist theorizations of dance and what it was about dance that attracted modernist artists, thinkers. Craig's idea of the actor as super puppet, dependent, of course, on Kleist's marionette essay of 1810, which also questions the location of authority, pushes Craig into foregrounding the role of the director. Would he have done this without the figure of the dancer in his mind? And Olga certainly takes us through that argument. The figure of the dancer is never far from this debate about creative authority. Kleist's ballerina, Mallarmé on Louis Fuller, Eliot's escape from emotion, Yeats's how can we know the dancer from the dance? Isadora is among those who were heavily metaphorized in this respect. But this is in some ways to demean her own theorization of the dance, which Olga recovers. Craig's Übermarionette essay also takes us to the mechanization of the human, and indeed to forms of dance that lead to Merce Cunningham's computer-generated dance or VR productions today. Olga emphasizes that we might certainly see how Isadora herself was supremely aware of the mechanistic functioning of the body. She wrote in Art of the Dance, emotion works like a motor, it must be warmed up to run well. Olga shows that through her radical interpretation of dance, Isadora appeared supremely expressivist, but she also delivered the modernist obsession with impersonality, that of the dancer as medium. And following Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, this kind of sense of identity is both individuated and choral for Isadora. And I'm going to finish by quoting Olga's words, because she absolutely and astutely observes of Craig and Duncan's relations, the point that projects this book into further relations of performative in the field of performativity in relation to Hellenism. And in turn, says Olga, we read this Übermarionette in conjunction with Duncan's dancer, not in opposition, but as a double, as its double, as indeed both Plato and Artaud understand the double in theatre. Then they can be seen to be locked in an embrace and possibly dancing in the same chorus, a chorus that at once looks back to Greek tragedy and forward to modern dance. So if you'll forgive me, Olga, for focusing so much on the dance, I really want to thank you for initiating your amazing book with the exploration of this important relationship of dance, drama, performativity, theatricality. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you very much, Professor Jones. Thank you. So now it's you, Olga.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Liana, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Fiona and Susan, for making the book sound so much better than it actually is. I mean, it's always wonderful to hear such an informed and insightful and generous reading of one's work. I'm grateful to you both, because you both engaged with from different perspectives, from your own disciplines, and opened up pathways that I hadn't considered. So in many ways, that's the best gift another colleague and friend can give to a writer or a scholar, an academic, is in a sense to continue that discussion. And you both did that in very nuanced and in very gracious ways. So I thank you both. What I would like to do briefly, because as I say, Fiona and Susan made the book sound so much better than it is. So this is going to be a letdown. I'm going to tease out a couple of the broader frameworks of the book that could perhaps also continue the discussion and open up the discussion. Thank you, everyone who's there at home as well. And all of you in some way have contributed to this book. And I need to say, as it was my last book, as you know, in post in Edinburgh, it kind of carries for me a particular resonance. So thank you all for being here. So what I wanted to do with this book is in many ways continue my work on modernism and performance, where every time I came across some kind of experimental mode in modernist performance, and of course, part of my work as a modernist is to also underline the centrality of performance for our broader understanding of modernism and modernity. And within that, most of the projects I encountered had this very strong and sometimes ambivalent attachment to some concept of Greek theatre. Most of these concepts were creative misreadings, however, that in some ways created, I think, legacies in performance studies and in the reception of Greek tragedy that in many ways we continue and occupy today. So both in its bid for the autonomy of performance, as it were, and its attempt to create a kind of genealogy with a kind of cultural capital, a genealogy for its own practice. So most of the projects in modernist performance that I delineate in this book, but it's not comprehensive, there are many, many more, have this strong attachment to the Greek model. And in many ways, in some ways it's seen as the epitome, of the projects of the Enlightenment, but also of its failures and its economies of representation. So in Brecht and Artaud, even though they define their projects against the Greek sense of theatre, it still shows a strong attachment. And that binary opposition in the manifesto and aphoristic style of both writers has been questioned recently by myself, by Martin Beverman, in the work of many scholars. So I'm continuing a reading there of the relationship between Brecht, Artaud, and Greek tragedy. In other cases, though, what I encountered was that this engagement with the Greeks, and they usually are called the Greeks, is not primarily textual, based on the plays of the tragedians, although there is also a very strong movement in modernist translation, which I try to engage with as well. But even when the projects are about translation, the emphasis is on performance. So as both readers of the book have mentioned, what I wanted to explore is the ways that Greek tragedy becomes this open field and the kinds of licenses it gives that inform all the other experiments. I also want, because these are the Greeks read through modernist anthropology and Nietzsche, of course, and I also wanted to underline the contribution of the Cambridge ritualists. In a sense, despite or because of the impact they've had on classical studies, I'm not so much concerned whether the ritualist school is right or wrong, in a sense, in a classical philological tradition. I'm more concerned in the ways the encounters with the Cambridge ritualists, Jane Harrison, Gilbert Murray, Cornford, through James Fraser, of course, the kinds of languages of performance that they helped to articulate and the kinds of interactions they allowed with the Greeks. At the same time, these interactions through modernist anthropology and this very charismatic group of scholars, even though Gilbert Murray, we know, was at Glasgow, that's for the Glasgow colleagues and not at Cambridge, has kind of been underestimated because of the ways that their work has been corrected within classical studies. But I do think in terms of performance, they were very, very significant. As significant as Nietzsche, I would say. And they're part of the same trajectory. What Nietzsche does to the philosophies of German idealism and romanticism, in many ways, the Cambridge ritualists allow these theater makers to create a kind of aesthetic that is much closer to that Nietzschean. It's the aesthetic equivalent of Nietzsche's philosophical stance. And then I wanted to explore this idea of theatricality as a way of engaging with the Greeks that is a bit more speculative and a bit more open-ended, that isn't necessarily textually based, that might be an influence from a vase, or might be something that has to do with modernist archaeology, that isn't necessarily either very systematic, but it becomes a kind of pose towards the ancients. And many people in the audience as well have written about this. But the notion that theatricality might open up a way of engaging with Hellenism that is a little bit more modernist and a little bit more to do with the performing arts. And indeed, it might itself offer a performative way of perhaps engaging with Greek tragedy. I also wanted to put theatricality on the kind of critical agenda of modernist studies a little bit more generally, and almost on a par with how the Russian formalists understand literariness. So it can become part of our critical vocabulary, so that, modernist drama a little bit more generally, modernist performance and dance studies could be included in the canon, as it were, of modernist studies. And I was particularly heartened by the way that Susan read the idea of theatricality and the way you went up to Beckett, because I've been thinking of ways of linking Beckett because it seems so obvious. And then you've given me a language for doing that through dance, which is very, very helpful and insightful. Thank you. Thank you. Another big discussion, perhaps, that the idea of the autonomy of performance, it leads to the debates about autonomy and commitment that lead up to the Frankfurt School. And I wanted to also underline the position of tragedy within those debates, right? And the way the ancient quarrel, as it were, between tragedy and epic, or tragedy and philosophy, gets reworked in these debates about autonomy and commitment between Brecht, Benjamin, Adorno, and Lukács, and these continue to this day. And again, I was heartened by Fiona's response to the way that the political aspect of this analysis might be resonant today as well. And if we get back by the debates, past the debates of the dramatic and the post-dramatic, or even the modernist and the postmodernism, and we're still inhabiting the unfinished project of modernity, as it were. So these debates are, I think, pertinent to this day. And the other thing I wanted to stress is in this genealogy of performance, on the one hand, modernist theatre makers are looking for a sense of totality, what we would understand as total theatre in a way. And the way that tragedy features within that, I would say, is maybe what we understand today as world theatre, right? So, for example, when Pound engages with tragedy, and he writes his very interesting translations that I try to write about as well, and several people have written about. He's also engaging with No and Kabuki. And that interface between Hellenism and what we might call modernist primitivism is interesting, because it kind of relocates Greek tragedy and actually Justin McConnell said this in a review, a very generous review. She says maybe it makes tragedy a little bit less Eurocentric. We would like to think so, although that's a generous reading in itself of tragedy. But I wanted to open up this discussion between East and West, between Hellenism and primitivism, between what we understand today as world theater. So a director like Ariane Mnouchkine, when she does the Atrides based on Katakali, I think there's a precedent to that. I think there's a genealogy of that interface between Greek tragedy as a mode of performance and what we would, again, today understand as world theater, right? And if we think of, then again, in another context, that interface, for example, Brecht and Chinese acting, at the same time that he's thinking about Antigone, there are interesting dialogues going on there about actor training as well that are inflected by the Greek model. So in some ways, this emphasis on theatricality wants to open up the engagement with the Greeks, as it were, and also present a way of introducing or including and integrating theater makers in this project. So in a sense, maybe what Rancière might call a redistribution of the sensible. So we don't have the philosopher or the classicist or the philologist engaging with Greek tragedy, in a sense that's basically textual or based on a certain sense of translation. We have poets, we have radical modernist poets like H.D., like Pound, like Eliot engaging with Greek tragedy, bringing to it their own sensibility and aesthetics. And we, of course, have actors, designers, directors engaging as well. So that kind of, it makes us understand what later became, the auteur tradition in engaging with Greek tragedy and the ensemble tradition, I think. So another link is that notion of world theater that might have a genealogy in these experiments. So if we think of the work of Ariane Mnouchkine, I mentioned Ninagawa, but also Lee Brewer, and this is a shout to my friend Maud and Lee, whose phenomenal gospel at Colonus in some ways could be seen as continuing the experiments in Christian tragedy by T.S. Eliot and Murder in the Cathedral, right? Of course, bringing to a completely different sensibility, but the ethos and the dialogue established is a similar one, I would say. So in some ways, I wanted to create that sense of continuity, to integrate tragedy in these big debates about commitment and autonomy within modernism, the quest for a total theater, and also, as both readers equally mentioned, is the notion that when we talk about modernism and theater, we usually use the term anti-Aristotelian or Aristotle features, or some version of Aristotelianism features that the modernists are against, because they're against whatever this version of Aristotelianism is. So, but I think maybe we should also go to Plato a little bit to discuss the anti-theatrical tradition and the politics of anti-theatricality and the ways those are rewritten within modernist performance. So, when Craig and Eleanor Dusha say we have to burn the theater, we have to burn the actors. So that there's a strong kind of aesthetics of catastrophe. It's almost engaging with the anti-theatrical tradition and doing something different with it. It's almost as if someone like Brecht is saying, yes, maybe Plato was right, but that's a good thing. The theater can move us and, and incite us to move to action, etc. So I wanted to read, and this is also following a movement by classicists like Leslie Kirk, for example, who see Plato as one of the first performance theorists. So I kind of wanted to bring that into the discussion as well. And I think I will stop now, and thank you again to both readers for those very generous comments.
Thank you, Olga. Can I just a second, because you said so much about global theater. Can I read 3 lines from your book, just a second, about this, so that
Yes,
just for everyone, the readers have read it, but for everyone. So you say Hellenism in this context is used as an umbrella term rather than classicism, which addresses mainly textual works and has traditionally had a primarily philological perspective. It connotes both the attempt to copy, imitate, pay homage to classical Greek aesthetic models and ideals, formally and thematically, and the attempt to inflect these and inject them with local and contemporary elements. This is classical Greek culture, Hellas, stretching across the southern and eastern Mediterranean and through the conquest of Alexander the Great, to West and Central Asia and parts of the Indian subcontinent. A crucial characteristic of Hellenism, one that also informed this analysis, is hybridity. Hellenism is a kind of classicism that is always informed and inflected by other cultural modes and traditions. It is an aspect that this book explores in its theatrical manifestations, as most of these modernist experiments approach the Greek model of theater in conjunctions with other performance traditions, sometimes non-European, sometimes deriving from local and popular traditions, or even Christianity that you just mentioned. So an agon of sorts is staged between the Greek traditions of performance and traditions which are considered to derive from popular oral legacies or non-European. We could claim that this agon might be constitutive of Hellenism itself. It is certainly one that informs modernist theatricality. Just so to go back to what you were saying about the global theater. So the floor is open for questions. You can raise your hands, you can shout out, or you can write in the chat if you want, and I will read the questions to the readers and to Olga. And please don't be shy. Yes, yes, please. Yes, please, Susan. Can you unmute yourself, please? Thank you.
It's just a comment to Olga before the questions get going.
Yes, of course.
I as you were talking about the anti-theatrical tradition, I was thinking of Wyndham Lewis, An Enemy of the Stars. Might be something to look at. I don't know.
Thank you.
Which is not meant to be performed.
That's with the bull running in.
Yeah.
I love that play. I've been teaching that play, and it's always, difficult to teach, but that is very, very helpful, actually.
Yeah, it just struck me that fits your category.
Yeah, yes, it does. Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Yes, please. Could you please unmute yourself? Thank you. Oh, we cannot hear you well. It's like your voice is like a robot's. So maybe can you try again?
Can I say something?
Yes. Is that better?
Yes,
That's
it is.
better,
Thank you
Robert.
very much.
Can people maybe also just say their names when they start talking, so everyone knows? Just say, I'm Robert Leach, that's all. Hello, Robert.
I'm Robert Leach. Not you. Hello, good evening. I have not yet had the pleasure of reading this work, and therefore I'm a little in ignorance of some of the things that have been said tonight, but I'm interested to ask you what your definition in this book of the word theatricality is. It's one of those words that is used a lot and not necessarily in the same with the same meaning each time it's used. So I wondered if you could expatiate a little bit upon that.
She has to do the whole book for you right now, eh?
No,
No, I'm joking, I'm joking.
Robert Leach is the leading modernist theorist in performance, so we all know his work and we all learn so much from his work. And it's a valid question. I mean, it's a little bit like justice, I would say, in the Brechtian sense. It is quite difficult to define. But in one way, everything that takes place from the stage to the, from the page to the stage, once we leave the page, everything that happens on the stage, we do. I mean, I think it's difficult to codify, but we have enough performance theory, as it were, to understand dramatic conventions. So really, it's what makes theater theater. What Shklovsky said, what makes a stone stone. I will respond to you in your Russian, with your Russian hat. So in a cheeky way, it's what makes theater theater. But it's everything that happens, including the word on the stage, everything that happens on the stage.
Okay, thank you.
Can I read a comment? Okay, so from Claire Warden. This has been a wonderful celebration. I wondered if Olga had anything further to say about the productive and creative potential of failure in modernist performance. It seems such a useful way to understand these performances and counters failure as a pejorative, seeing it instead as fruitful and exciting. Olga, unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, I'm doing that now. Thank you, Claire, and welcome, and I hope you're well. Yes, so this idea, once you have emphasis on process and the idea of the studio and the idea of the laboratory, which is such a given in performance studies and in pedagogy, then the idea of failure is constitutive to the process. But I think what happened with a lot of these performances, that they were, like, in a sense, pragmatically and historically considered as failures because they didn't have long runs, or some of them didn't even reach the stage. They were, look at Craig and Duncan, they never worked together. They could have worked together. He designed characters from Greek tragedy, never produced them. This, in one sense, allows a little bit more kind of a reflective and speculative approach that doesn't, result in a production. But it also, when you say, Claire, that it has to be positive, and it's not always positive. It's also introducing a tragic aesthetic to theatricality. Some of them were not great, and I don't think that it's, again, trying to get away from a tragic sensibility if you want to make failure positive. Failure is failure, but as failure in a kind of sense, in a kind of negativity, embracing a kind of negativity as part of the process. So yeah, that's what I think.
Vasiliki, go ahead. Hi.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations, Olga. This is wonderful, extremely rich and a very moving book, I think, in so many ways, for modernists and theatre specialists alike and classes. So, and thank you to the two respondents for wonderful responses, but also framings and suggestions. I actually wanted to follow up on Claire's question about failure, because this has been sort of buzzing in my head. I mean, I know that you've already written on this I think, very beautifully. Actually, somebody, I think one of the respondents also made quoted you on the idea of Greek tragedy as in the hands of modernists as a kind of experimental space, you know, which I think is also, I suppose, partly what Claire may have meant by the idea of productivity, you know, and what you have so lucidly explained, you know, in your account of process and so on. But there's a cognate sense of failure which keeps sort of, you know, that I keep thinking about, again, in terms of modernism, and it's failure in the sense that, and again, it's not really an exact definition, but I think it's cognate in the way in Woolf's hands, in the, you know, in the essay on not knowing Greek, there's the you know, the fundamental sort of conceit, you could say, and the very enabling device of the not knowing, you know, the declaring a kind of fundamental inaccessibility and a radical unintelligibility that then, of course, she twists and turns onto something which becomes the possibility for other types of articulation. So, and I know, I mean, you've already said that you're not dealing with tragedy in the sense of the text, you know, which is what, of course, was Woolf's concern, because she was partly, you know, making a point about the common reader and, you know, what would happen, you know, how would a common reader still have access to something without the mediation of the scholarly translation and so on. So already there, you know, that's a question and a debate and a concern of Woolf's that's to do more so with the page, and as you say, the legacy than the process and performance. Though of course she's so interested in performance. I mean, in her last novel, you know, we have fascinating, you know, very Harrisonian sort of experiment with that. But what would you, I mean, how would you riff on that? You know, the failure and unknowability, I mean, how far would you go with that? I mean, you know, would Woolf then have a place in your roster?
Yeah, thank you, Vasiliki, and again, thank you for being here as well, and thank you for being my lifelong friend and colleague with whom we've had discussions about this book for the last 20 years, it seems. So that's a very interesting point about that interface between failure and unintelligibility. I mean, I don't know enough about, I mean, I've read all the books about, and your work about Woolf and Hellenism, but I'm not, what I would like to add, so I think there is an interface between failure and unintelligibility. Where we might see it in the modernist performances, I think is a lot, also could be in the translations and in the element of unperformability. So the way that a lot of these translations, the kind of unintelligibility that you're talking about in not knowing Greek, you know, how that negativity works, could also be seen in the way that, think of Pound's translations, for example, or yes, and T.S. Eliot's translations. They don't all lend themselves well for performance, or they challenge what we understand as performance. So together to this, you know, next to this idea of unintelligibility, I would add unperformability. So, and sometimes the way we interpret this, and I've written about this in the book as well, is that, for example, we did, you know, Craig didn't make his Umber marionette because he lacked the technology. So it's a matter of belatedness and a matter of kind of chronological progression. We can do it now. Or we couldn't stage Pound's works because we didn't engage enough with modernism and dance, for example. So we can do it now. But I think there's an element in this unintelligibility and unperformability that's about futurity, maybe, about as a utopian aspect, which opens up the whole category of either cognitive, you know, dissonance or performability, and asks you to engage with that. So I mean, the parallel I can draw with Pound's translations, for example, when we read them, they kind of force us to think about, you think, or Enemy of the Stars, you know, how are we going to do that? how will this happen on the stage? So it asks you visually to, to think about theatricality, in a sense, right? To start thinking about theatricality in a more articulate and conscious way. Yeah. So, yeah, I think the relationship between Hellenism and unintelligibility in Woolf could have a parallel or interface with maybe this concept of unperformability.
Yes, I was yes, go ahead, Professor Jones. I was going to read what you wrote on your on the chat, but you are muted.
I'm so sorry. On that point about unperformability, Olga, and Woolf's essay as well, I'm wondering if we could think a bit about Beckett's, famous line about fail again, fail better, which of course does have a sort of positivity about it. But I'm wondering if there's also something inside that idea of unperformability, the notion of the rehearsal, the répétition. And well, I mean, for Beckett, of course, it is répétition, so it is very specifically repetition. And I wonder if it's that openness to repeat, but to repeat not exactly in the same way, to find a kind of original or something new.
Yes. Can I come in? Yes,
yeah, please.
Definitely. And it's interesting how you followed it up with the unintelligibility thing. But the idea of the rehearsal, again, the process, and always the same, but always different, is a way of talking about performance. But what also happens within that process is we begin to have a relationship between, because we're talking about textual. It's important.
I realize that. Yeah.
But we have also a relationship, and I think performability, theatricality, but also adaptation and translation and performance. So what is an adaptation? What is a translation? What is an original work, right? And Becker, again, you should do the book on Becker. And there's a colleague here, Vayos Lapis, who also writes on Becker and tragedy. It's such a fascinating subject. And the idea of repetition, of course.
Yeah.
Right, which is in dance, which comes from dance as well.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Professor McIntosh.
Sorry, I realize that I like Sue. I've had my say to some extent, but one thing I didn't mention, and I'd like to hear more from Olga. One thing I found really, really helpful was how you explain your use of Hellenism, and as being taking its cue from the Hellenistic period, from kind of hybridity, and I think you go on to say diasporic, kind of diffuse, in marked contrast, where the center is Alexandria, and in marked contrast to Athens and sort of classicism. And I found that, and obviously in some ways my question or my inference might be that very much comes and is indeed around your discussion of HD. However, I wondered, I find it really, really helpful to think about using that term very consciously in relation to the modernist period, in marked contrast to, maybe what some classical reception people will do, being hung up with, classical classicizing and so on. So I don't know whether that was deliberate. And if so, I really think we need to think about rolling this out massively, because it is so helpful. And I think that it's, and the distinction you really importantly make between Romantic Hellenism, obviously, but the way it's being used differently at this point. And I don't know at what point you were, aware of how, or are you aware of how important that is and how you need to educate us all?
Thank you. That's a very, very bold claim. I was very nervous about that. about that, because that definition of Hellenism is very ad hoc. You know, it's very, it's all over the place. And I knew that a proper classicist, and a lot of people could have issues with it. But I also thought, what the heck? You know, in a way, that's how I'm using it. I'm using it speculatively. It's the section that Liana read earlier about Hellenism, how it's defined in the book. And I did think a lot about it. And yes, I chose that bigger, the non-Athens centric view in a sense. And also I'd like to tie it in with this idea of the engagement with Greek tragedy during this period foreshadows world theater, right? Mm-hmm. So if we decenter it from Athens, and if it's in dialogue with No, you know, and again, Pound is very significant here when he says, I want to perform the Trachinie using No, and I want not Michio Ito, another dancer, to perform it. It's a very radical imagination to do that. First of all, to translate it in the way he does it, although it's not as radical as Electra, I think, and then to reconceptualize it like that, which means he's taking it out of Athens. Although he did have an issue with HT, he thought Alexandrian Hellenism was nostalgic and feminine. You know all these debates, right? Yeah. Yes, but to be honest with you, Fiona, I was afraid that the way I used that concept wasn't rigorous enough, but I thought I'll just open it up a little bit and try to see, and also because the way the modernists use Hellenism isn't that systematic, but it's very, very different from what came before it. So this is an attempt to talk about it a little bit differently.
I think it's very
yeah, I agree too. I actually think that it's supported by not just by the modernist but the tragedies themselves. So I think it's totally rigorous myself. So I have a question here. I don't know if Vasiliki, you have your hand up again. Do you, or is it left from before?
No, I just wanted to comment very briefly on this matter of nomenclature, which I think Fiona's comment was spot on, and I think Olga is. I think Fiona is right. Has done a great thing in actually, offering that definition, and the connection with hybridity and world theatre is absolutely spot on. But I would also add that it really opens up productively this very slippery, Appalachian Hellenism, including the various contradictions, which to me also, I think what could be kind of folded in is this kind of at times this idea of lateness, and which is there in the background of some of the recourse to Hellenism. That kind of contradicts the idea of somehow, the Greeks as the kind of, the childhood of humanity, and, some kind of, obviously, another kind of classical ideal, as opposed to, of course, the later hybridity or a slightly more decadent culture and so on. But of course, it's that, of course, if you read it, if you keep the duet with modernism all along in a definitional sense, then it creates very interesting tension, because with the concept of modernity and, futurity in the sense of that you're building something new and something that might be strange and so on. But in Pound's terms, early Pound, in the Images period, for instance, his point was his formula was a binary one. He said, I thought of modernists and Hellenists as there'd be two types of images. There would be the modernist images and there would be the Hellenists. So, he's somebody who's grappling with what Hellenism actually means until the end, as you say, the later phase where he, with his translation of the Women of Trachis and so on, I think, attempts to actually redefine, redefine the term. So I mean, this was kind of all over the place, but I think it's a very, very interesting, I think it's work that we still need to do to, really finesse, that actually very, fluid term.
Thank you.
So I wanted to read a question from Jane Goldman. How has your own experience writing for theater and performance informed your development of your thinking?
Thank you, Jane. Hello, Jane, also long-term friend and colleague. So this is the Glasgow contingent. Hello, Jane. Thank you for being with us. That's a very good question. Of course, the answer is yes. How is I don't have one answer to how. It opened up, and as I mentioned, it opened up the possibility of what the stage can do, for example, and having that lifelong association with a stage also made me less fearful about reading some of these plays that are just so difficult to read. And then you think, oh, if you see them as performance pieces, that opens up a whole other perspective of engagement, both pleasurable engagement as a reader, but also critical engagement. So yes, so working with someone like Maud and Lee, for example, that was a revelation. It opens up even more possibilities that I hadn't thought about, the ways, about the adaptability of these plays. And this is, again, a great gift. I'm sorry to be very Greek here, but the fact that they can be rewritten, restaged. Again, I think what these modernist experiments also allow us to do is to move away from the concept of authenticity. That somehow either the performance will be more authentic because we can now have women on the stage, or it can be more authentic because now we have the technologies that can reproduce, you know what I mean? So the whole concept of either reconstruction or even a core humanism, that's the radical thing. It isn't simply the idea of reproducing a sense of how these plays were staged. I think the way that the texts are interpreted also goes against the very humanist, enlightened, primarily Anglo-German, but primarily German way of reading Greek tragedies. And that's why I think the Cambridge ritualists are crucial in that time. And for me, as I say, my own experience has shown me, again, how adaptable, how open, what Benjamin says about translation when he says certain texts have this principle of translatability written within them, that they make us reconceptualize not only the target language, but the mother tongue, and just call it the mother tongue as well. So the Greeks become more familiar or more strange, but so do the moderns. And that's what I think these translations do, but also that's what performance does. It at once makes the text more familiar, not necessarily psychologically or expressively, more familiar in the sense that you embody it, or you read it, or you hear it out loud. It's more familiar, but also more strange. Thank you, Jane.
So Jane, sorry, Jane responded, thank you. You've opened up this app for modernist pedagogy. Okay, sorry, who was talking and I interrupted, sorry.
No, it was just me.
Oh, okay, hi. Hi.
Thank you, Olga. I do think that this approach will change what we do in the classroom and in the conference space with readings of modernism. So thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
And I can't wait to see what your latest theatrical production.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
So, any other thoughts, questions, afterthoughts? Anybody? The book is right now being coming out as a paperback. So I hope those of you who have not read it can get it and read it and get the joy I got from reading it. If there are no other questions, we can stop here. I would like to thank very much Professor McIntosh and Professor Jones for their amazing response to the book, Olga for having written the book, and Edinburgh University Press for publishing it, and all of you for being here. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Liana. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you very much.
I'm very grateful to everyone for being here.
Thank
Bye.
And
Bye-bye,
Maria and
everyone.
Petros for organizing everything for us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Liana.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Susan.
Sorry,